thank you again, Reverend Nix, for bringing me into such a beautiful community and sharing in such wonderful fellowship. So for those of you who were also at Sharoneth yesterday, you know that we've been looking at religious ideas of what it means to be human, because these ideas shape public policy and social norms. They matter. They're often at the heart of our culture wars, and ultimately, these ideas shape who gets to be human, counted as human, and thus how they're treated. So politically, we erase people's humanness all the time. Immigration is an obvious example. Immigrants are frequently called aliens, think about that one, right? And if they have no documentation, of course, then they're called illegal aliens. And this administration has stripped the bias bare. The president's called immigrants garbage and criminals. The former Homeland Security Secretary endorsed what she called a full travel ban on every damn country that's been flooding our nation with killers and leeches and entitlement junkies. This kind of rhetoric enables immigrants to be hunted, rounded up, locked up, shipped off, all in ways that violate their basic human rights. But today I want to talk about people who have their humanity erased in a different way by asserting that they don't exist. And that's trans folks. So for people who don't exist, there's an awful lot of fuss about them. There are 740 anti-trans bills that have been introduced or reintroduced already this year. And I hate to tell you this, Missouri has the tragic honor of being number 2 among the states after Oklahoma, with 52 such bills currently under consideration. So for example, HB 20, I'm sorry, there's one more I should have said. Yeah, there we go. HB 2526 says there are only 2 sexes, and every individual is either male or female, as observed or clinically verified at birth. Then, even though this bill states trans folks don't exist, other bills are limiting their health care, censoring books about them, blocking access to health, to sports and bathrooms, and restricting their civil rights. And this renders their bodies and their lives really doubly incoherent and magnifies the growing violence against them. Often double violence, because transgender women who have survived attacks, they are 6 times more likely than to experience more physical violence during interactions with the police than compared to, not the general population, but other gay, lesbian, or bisexual survivors. So transgender individuals are also, as you know, cast as political bait. Senate Republicans tried to insert anti-trans legislation into the Save America Act. It has nothing to do with the bill's purpose, which is to find ways to dump people off the voter rolls or not count their votes. But they did it so that they could paint Democrats opposing the bill as consumed with identity politics, out of touch with American values. So apparently, if you think, as I do, that sports organizations should be the one regulating who's eligible to play in their leagues rather than the government, you're an extremist like me. So the assumption is that gender nonconforming, transgender, or non-binary identities are modern inventions, an ever-growing, confounding list of woke nonsense. The fact is that these are not modern inventions. They are ancient realities. Both Judaism and Christianity have rich traditions that recognize gender diversity and a spectrum that is part of the fearfully and wonderfully made diversity of creation. But think about it. You know the answer to this, I'm sure. What is the most common justification for the claim that there are only 2 sexes?
Adam and Eve.
Yep. The stories of human creation in Genesis. Male and female, God created them. It says so. The religious ideas about gender affect our world in all kinds of ways, including gender hierarchies that privilege men over women, gender roles, sexuality, but I want to focus on gender diversity for a few reasons. There's nothing so dehumanizing as being erased from existence. And because we can learn something from our history rather than over against it, right? Sometimes we're trying to modernize the tradition. Here, the tradition has something surprising to a lot of people to teach us. And because religious communities see the Bible as sacred scripture, we have a special role to play. Anti-trans voices are using our sacred texts to make their assault on human rights seem righteous. So Sky Perryman at Democracy Forward says that courage is the new currency. I like that. Paul Rauschenbucht of the Interfaith Alliance and took that and argued that religious communities then need to start minting courage, right? And spending it lavishly. So that's where I got my title. And I wonder how it is that we can mint courage. But first it requires knowledge, and I'm going to spend most of our time together working on that. Amidst the attacks on fact-based journalism and the undermining of science and the censorship of history, building knowledge is an act of resistance. And it is itself a courageous action. Moreover, courage and knowledge are deeply intertwined. Knowledge is power, we've heard that, and I still believe it. Even facing people who are deeply certain of things that just aren't so, who don't want to consider new information, knowledge produces, at least for ourselves, the courage of our conviction, the courage to take action. It doesn't matter if we're talking about trans rights or immigration or reproductive justice or protecting democracy, knowledge is a powerful tool for minting courage. So let's mint us some currency as we examine religious ideas about gender. If I was going to ask for an example of gender diversity beyond male and female in the Bible, does anything come to mind?
David and Jonathan.
David and Jonathan get raised frequently as a possible same-sex love relationship, right? I'm actually thinking about more than two genders, right? So not about sexuality, but about gender identity. Anything come to mind in the Bible about that? So some people think of the eunuch, right? You can debate whether or not this constitutes a third sex. We have later religious sources that talk about 6 genders, 6 sexes, and count the eunuch among them. So we also have gender nonconforming saints and gender dysmorphia and eschatological androgyny. That's a big word, right? We're not going to have genders in the end of times. And more. But let's start with the eunuch. Isaiah 56 says, "Let not the eunuch say," and you'll look at me if like it doesn't make any sense with what I just had you switch to. Okay, good. I can't see it. "Let not the eunuch say, I am a withered tree. For thus said Yahweh, as for the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who have chosen what I desire and hold fast to my covenant, I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not perish." And the prophet goes on to offer a similar reassurance in God's name for foreigners who hold fast to the covenant, concluding, "My house shall be a house of prayer for all peoples." By the way, the original Hebrew text for a monument and a name is Yad Vashem. So some of you may recognize that. That's the name given to the Israeli Holocaust Memorial, a remembrance for all those whose lives and legacy was brutally annihilated in the Shoah. Isaiah, however, is speaking to the returnees from Babylon, right? To a people who are concerned about rebuilding the community in the land of Israel after several generations in exile. So you can see in this project of rebuilding why the eunuchs might despair of their ability to contribute. They can't have kids. Plus, while eunuchs have a formal role to play in a lot of the foreign courts in order to be trusted among women in the harem or even allowed close access to power, castration was not generally encouraged or necessary in Judean culture, so that special role was kind of gone. But Isaiah insists, you are seen, you count, you're valued. You may also remember that in Matthew 19, Jesus speaks of eunuchs from birth, and those made by other people, and those who choose it for themselves, for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, concluding that anyone accept this who can. And there's the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8. On the way home from worshiping at the temple in Jerusalem, he encounters Philip. Philip's been sent by the Spirit to go and speak with him. And he hears the eunuch reading Isaiah. And the subsequent conversation so impresses the eunuch that he requests to be baptized. Now, each of these passages is complex, and there's a lot more we could say if we had time, but it's vital that we recognize these three texts are not concerned with what body parts these folks have or don't have, but rather with how to advance their spiritual well-being. And religious communities today would be very wise to follow suit. Now, you may have heard that the Ethiopian eunuch was turned away from the temple, even though actually there's nothing in the passage that suggests it. It comes probably from two sources of error. One is a tendency to cast Judaism as exclusive in order to highlight Jesus' teachings of inclusivity. But the other is a misunderstanding of a Deuteronomy verse in chapter 23, where it says that a man whose testes are crushed or whose penis is cut off shall not be admitted to Kahal Yahweh, it's frequently translated as the assembly of the Lord. And it doesn't mean that they can't worship or participate in the religious life of the community. That's not what not entering the assembly means. It means it's a political status. They don't have voting rights for certain issues, like the appointment of kings or land distribution. So the Ethiopian eunuch would have been welcome to offer his sacrifice, etc. But of course, the loss of political rights is still problematic, so it's a good time to mention, even for all the wonderful things I'm going to say about what the tradition teaches, that the teachings are not uniformly enlightened about gender diversity. And it was, as it is today, a matter of some debate. But early on, it appeared that some Christians took Jesus' words literally, choosing to be castrated for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. It's possible, actually, that Origen was included in that number. But then the Council of Nicaea declared that such a choice would disqualify you from the priesthood, and later sentiment turned against this. John Chrysostom called eunuchs the devil's work. Augustine was a little more tempered. He said that a eunuch is neither changed into a woman nor allowed to remain a man, but he insisted that the eunuch is still human. It's sad, of course, that that was a question he had to weigh in on, but it does suggest the eunuchs were seen as a third sex. So Jesus' teachings about eunuchs became spiritualized. It was translated into celibacy and spiritual devotion. Yet physical eunuchs...
I screwed up, I'm on the wrong slide.
Nope, go back. Back. Wow, we're gonna go way back.
I told you.
How did you?
Is it page
Go
down?
back.
Are you still ahead? Just one moment, please.
There.
Oh, page up. Sorry. Taking good help.
Pretty good help. So physical eunuchs continue to be a part of church and society. Castrati, the castrated boys who were employed as sopranos in church choirs until 1903, when Pope Pius X said it was no longer acceptable. They continued. So Catherine Ringrose's study of Byzantine civilization also shows that eunuchs were distinctive in their physical appearance, in their dress, their manner. They were considered uniquely suited for important roles in Byzantine life, transcending traditional, conventional notions of male and female. Eunuchs lived outside normal patterns of procreation and inheritance, and they were assigned this unique capacity for mediating across social and spiritual boundaries. So even with these uniquely gendered lines, eunuchs are not, as I said, universally recognized as a distinct sex, but they are in rabbinic sources. Yes. Which identify 6 sexes. So they talk about the zachar, male, and nekeva, female. Also the androgynos, the intersex person, someone with both male and female sexual characteristics. They talk about the tumtum, a person with indeterminate or obscured sexual characteristics. The tumtum was generally treated as a man because that gave them better legal civil rights benefits, but could marry a man or a woman as they saw fit. They talked about the Ilonit, which is a person who was identified female at birth but develops male characteristics by puberty and is infertile. And they talked about the Saris as one of these 6, a person who's identified as male at birth but develops female characteristics by puberty or is lacking male genitalia. So a Saris, the rabbis noted, could be a natural Saris, somebody who's born that way, or someone who becomes a Saris, a eunuch, through castration. I put these little numbers in parentheses, if you can see them, of the last 4, because it represents how many times the term appears in the Talmud. Now, admittedly, the Talmud is a really big set of books, but I put them there so that you could see this diversity was an accepted part of their reality. It's not a scandalous part, it's not an unheard of part, right? One text actually suggests that Abraham was a tumtum and Sarah was an Ilonit. And to the rabbis, that just highlighted how miraculous it was that they could finally have children together, because that was obviously then God's doing. So I didn't bring that text. I brought a different text for us to look at from the Mishnah, which is an early 3rd century text that tries to sketch out for rabbinic Jews how to live in accordance with the values of the Torah. Right? It says, keep Shabbat, well, how do you do that? It doesn't get specific, those kinds of, everything under the sun. How to eat, how to talk, how to do business, and it talks about intersex folks, which is what we're going to look at here, the androgynos. So the legal status of the androgynos, it says, is like men in some ways, and like women in some ways, like both men and women in some ways, and like neither men nor women in some ways. So the primary concern here, as developed in the subsequent passages, is should they observe Jewish praxis that men do or that women do? And the next passage then lists some of the practices that apply to them as men, and the passage after that lists some of the practices that apply to them as women. So it's recognizing they're unique, and they do some of both. And they try to figure out which are the most apt to this unique and distinct sex. But we're going to look at the 4th passage in this chapter, and it describes that 3rd category, the praxis that would apply to both men and women, and thus obviously would apply to the androgynos as well. And I keep saying it with the Greek pronunciation, or the Hebrew pronunciation actually, because it's understood conceptually a little different than androgynous, which is, we tend to think of as having kind of no gender. Right? So how is the legal status of the androgynos similar to both men and women? Here are the examples they bring. One is subject to punishment for striking or cursing him, to exile for inadvertently killing him, and to receive the death penalty for murdering him. He also partakes of holy offerings and inherits, as both men and women do. And he says, if I'm a Nazirite, since this is a status, if I'm a Nazirite, now I am a Nazirite, which is a vow that people could take unto themselves and commit themselves to particular practices and of piety. And since that status is available to both men and women, the androgynous too can say, now I am a Nazirite. So notice that out of the thousands of examples that the rabbis could bring of what laws would apply to men and women, they bring examples that make clear this person's civil rights must be protected, right? You will be punished if you attack them. They are fully included in the spiritual community. They get to partake in the offering. And they have the same degree of autonomy as everybody else. They can make their religious vows. So imagine how different our political climate would feel if we could just agree that people whose gender doesn't fit the standard male and female construct still have these rights. Next passage is also important. In the fifth Mishnah of this chapter, Rabbi Meir, some say Rabbi Yossi, says, an androgynos, he is a created being of her own. Notice the switch up in the pronouns. It's an acknowledgement, really, that sometimes the normative categories or language just don't suffice. And notice also that by speaking about the androgynos as a created being, it emphasizes God's role in creating the intersex person. So in fact, the rabbis taught the very first human was created intersex. Here's a 5th century midrash. Rabbi Jeremiah, the son of Lazar, said, when the Holy One of Blessing created the first human, Adam Harishon, God created it androgynos. As it is said, male and female, God created them. Not 2 genders, but one intersex person. Now, the midrash is not just playing, right? It's come to resolve a textual difficulty. Can anybody guess what it is?
2 creation stories.
Exactly. We've got 2 creation stories, and the second one's very detailed about we had this Adam, which is not a guy named Adam, but we had a human being, and then we have this gendered person created from Adam's side, and then we talk about them as male and female. So, so in the first story, it looks like they're being created simultaneously, and in the second, when the Adam goes to sleep and God creates the woman, rabbis figured, okay, the first human had all genders, and then what happens in the second story is they get split into 2 separate ones. So this idea of the primal androgyne, right, the androgynos, was affirmed actually in a number of Christian sources as well. Given Christian ambivalence about sexuality, it sometimes appears more like an agendered person rather than a multi-gendered person, but that still shows us gendered diversity, and it troubles modern assumptions that biblical religion always had affirmed a divinely inscribed binary. Gregory of Nyssa believed that Adam and Eve before, yes, I think so. And I thought I had a Gregory of Nyssa slide. Did I miss it? Oh yeah, these are just pictures. There we go. No, that's backwards. Is that Gregory of Nyssa? Okay. He believed that Adam and Eve, before eating from the tree, were what Leah Devon calls angelic androgynes, or androgynes, a lost prototype of human nature that reflected God's purity and simplicity and transcended the need for bodily distinction. Sexual difference, as he viewed it, is not an inherent part of human nature, because we didn't need to reproduce until we became mortal. This is Gregory of Nyssa. Others saw the be fruitful and multiply and thought we were always going to do that. But Gregory also claimed that humans would regain their lost angelic state following the general resurrection at the end of time. This eschatological transcending of sex was actually found among a lot of Christian thinkers, doing away with male and female. It focused on shared humanity and the restoration of the full divine image in its fullness. Since Jesus was understood as a sort of preview of this unity, we find a number of surprising medieval descriptions, illustrations of him as both male and female. I don't know if you can see this very well, but he's got well-defined breasts. I have a second example that's not quite as striking. Nonetheless, a fairly feminized-looking figure compared to the other apostles behind him. So, we see historical religious roots for the conviction that biological sex is not binary. What about the feeling that you were born in the wrong body, which a lot of our trans friends have this issue. Before the modern age, we didn't understand much about psychology or identity, but the traditions demonstrate they certainly understood social constructions of gender, because most of the cross-dressing saints that populate historical Christian literature are presented as women whose lives were so circumscribed by their societal expectations that they cut their hair, changed their clothes, and reinvented themselves as men. I'm going to share a few. The earliest we know is Saint Thecla. She was persecuted by her family and society for leaving her fiancé in order to follow Paul. And Thecla survives 2 martyr trials, the first by fire and the second by beasts in the arena. She then baptizes herself after her release, dresses like a man, and travels around teaching the gospel. So what is the church's response to this cross-gendered drag behavior? She's named a saint. In the 5th century, we have the story of a woman named Marina who refuses to marry. Instead, she shaves her hair, changes her name to Marinas, dons men's clothes, and joins a monastery with their father. And after an overnight stay at an inn while doing business for the monastery, Marinas is falsely accused of seducing the innkeeper's daughter and getting her pregnant. He's thrown out of the monastery, Marinas is, and he lives outside the gates, eventually joined by his putative child, whom he raises. And after several years, the brothers take them both in, and Marinus' biological sex isn't revealed until his death. Marina/Marinus, the monk, is also recognized as a saint. One more story among the scores that could be told. Wilgefortis is the Christian daughter of a pagan Portuguese king, and she has secretly dedicated her virginity to God. And when she refuses to marry the neighboring ruler as her father arranged, her father's furious and locks her in the dungeon. And she prays to God to make her repulsive to her would-be suitor so that he won't marry her. And the next morning, she wakes up with a full beard. The bridegroom goes running, just as she'd hoped, but her father is even angrier, demands to know what happened. Wilgefortis explains that it has come from the God whom she adores, prompting her father to announce, "Then you shall die like him that you adore," and he has his daughter crucified. Now, she appears in multiple works of art like this, Christ-like, venerated as a folk saint, not an official one, mostly by women seeking protection from bad marriages. And this painting actually depicts a story in which she saved this wrongly accused man who took refuge at the foot of her portrait by miraculously releasing one of her shoes out of the painting into the miracle proved he must not be guilty. So Jessica Nipple argues that these narratives of the gender-bending and cross-dressing saints create within the Christian tradition a space for stories that queer normative notions of gender as binary. And while Jewish tradition doesn't have saints, we also have stories of revered women who queered the binary because they wanted to teach and those sorts of things. Now, you may notice that all these stories so far are stories of individuals born female living as men. In some ways, that simply reinforces the gender hierarchy that attached true piety and intellect and virtues to men. So even though both Rabbinic Judaism and early Christianity radically transformed the characteristics of masculine virtue so that piety and learning became measures of heroism in place of military feats, and both cultures still, however, remained profoundly patriarchal. But let's examine an excerpt from a poem by a well-known Jewish poet from the 14th century France, Kalonymos, son of Kalonymos. He wrote, "Lord in heaven, who brought forth wonders by fire and water for our fathers, cooling Abraham's Chaldean kiln so in its flames he'd not be burned, who altered Dinah's fate in the womb and made a serpent of Moses' wand, who whited with illness Miriam's hand and turned the sea of reeds into land, transforming the muddy bed of the Jordan into passable sand, and making from stone and shale a pool whose springs would not fail, if only you would make me female. If that alone might be done, then how wondrous then would be my fortune. So he wishes to be a woman. Note there are lots of references. The biblical stories probably most of you get. A couple are to earlier rabbinic, midrashim, the idea of cooling Abraham's Chaldean kiln. There's a midrash where Nimrod throws Abraham into the fire, and it's very much built on the Daniel story. So just take what you know about the Daniel story. Abraham is saved from the fire, and that's really impresses Nimrod. Altering Dinah's fate in the womb is actually kind of a touching midrash about Leah praying for her fetus to become female so that her sister, who has not had children yet and is having trouble conceiving, could later give birth to sons who would still be counted among the 12 tribes. So it was going to be a boy, but Dinah prayed and it got turned into a girl, and Dinah was born, and well, sadly she didn't count as one of the 12 tribes. Anyway, what do all of these miracles have in common? God changes natural law in response to human needs or desires. Splits the sea because they gotta get across. Right? So here, the author wants God to change natural law and make him female rather than male. The poem continues. Spared the arduous labor of men, I'd settle down and raise my children. But why complain and bitterly whine, if my Father in heaven is so inclined as to fashion me with a lasting deformity? How could I ask that he take it from me? Worry about what just can't be is incurable pain and endless misery. And empty condolence is hardly an answer. I'll just have to bear it, I said, though I'll suffer until I wither away and die. And since long ago I learned from tradition that both good and bad deserve benediction, in the faintest of whispers, I'll mutter each morning, Blessed art thou, O Lord, who hast not made me a woman. So, why does he want to be created as a woman? The poem says that such a person would be spared arduous labor, they could spend more time with their kids, but it also speaks about being male feeling as a deformity, which is an experience that trans folks sometimes describe in relationship to their bodies. And the punchline of the poem, if you will, adds a kind of a satirical edge. It's a reference to one of a litany of blessings that Jews recite in the morning. Greek texts actually had a similar practice. They spoke of expressing gratitude to the gods for being created a free person rather than a slave, male rather than female, Greek rather than barbarian. Right? So the rabbinic adaptation of this practice added all kinds of blessings for being able to see and to stand and basically waking up alive, trying to thank God for all of those things. And they kept the male-female one, explaining that it made sense from a Jewish perspective because men benefited from the additional commandments bestowed upon them. They had additional ritual obligations. But the poem questions whether the trade-off is worth it. The male poet still recites the blessing, but only because he believes we should bless God for everything, whether we consider it good or bad. By the way, when Orthodox women pray, they bless God for making them according to the divine will. And some feminists critique views that alternative as a little insulting, but others see it as liberating, an affirmation of what every single person is, a unique and special creation and a manifestation of God's will. Non-Orthodox traditions have revised the litany, and the distinction, male-female distinction, is gone. We don't praise God for making us one gender or another. So given all this history, how did people come to believe in a binary male-female? That was the eternal, comprehensive, universal description of biological sex or gender identity. Well, sometimes you'll hear scholars talk about ancient and medieval concepts of a single gender, male, of course, from which women and others were a deviation. And these scholars describe a profound shift especially in the Victorian era, that established the male-female as a binary with complementary but distinct roles. So more simply, we can think about the binary, that's the modern phenomenon, arising with scientific categorization as everything got sorted into tidy boxes. But historically, male and female were understood simply as the most common, the norm. It didn't apply to everyone, and norm was not confused with good. It's important because we confuse them a lot today. Norm was not confused with good. Our spiritual ancestors were still regulating gender in ways that were problematic, but Judaism and Christianity both show that they wrestled with gender diversity and celebrated it within the spectrum of God's creation. Embracing gender diversity isn't a departure from faith. It's an expression. So this offers another tool for minting courage, because our spiritual inheritance helps to firm the ground under our feet in this world. The religious community in which we participate can provide another tool. We are not alone. And together, our tradition and our congregation help align our decisions with our values. Now, you may not think that fighting against anti-trans hatred takes courage. You may not think that speaking up takes courage, and that's good because it takes a phenomenal amount of courage if you are trans. And they need allies. So let's close by thinking about currency of courage more broadly for all the fights that matter right now. Courage isn't the absence of fear, but taking action even though we are afraid. It's moving out of our comfort zone even though we know the risks. We think about fear differently, letting caution be that friend who helps us navigate the challenges but doesn't hold us back. And we start small, we build habits, we grow muscles of courage. Find the people who make us brave, and we're clear about the values that form the fundament of our being. We know what we are fighting.